Sarah Mitchell wheeled her chair through the entrance of Riverside High School, her heart heavy with the familiar weight of another day ahead. The 17-year-old had been paralyzed from the waist down since a car accident 3 years ago, but the physical challenge of navigating life in a wheelchair was nothing compared to the emotional burden of facing her classmates every day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hallway as students rushed past her, some accidentally bumping into her chair without so much as an apology. Sarah had learned to expect this treatment. To most of her peers, she had become invisible, an obstacle to maneuver around rather than a person to acknowledge. Her first class was English literature, and as she approached the classroom, she could hear the familiar voices of the popular group already inside. Jessica Crawford, the self-proclaimed queen of the school, was holding court with her followers. Sarah took a deep breath and entered the room, immediately feeling the shift in atmosphere. "Oh look, here comes Wheels," Jessica whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Her cronies giggled as Sarah made her way to her usual spot at the back of the classroom. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was busy writing on the whiteboard, and either didn't hear the comment or chose to ignore it. Sarah had grown accustomed to the nickname, though it stung every time. She pulled out her textbook and tried to focus on the lesson about courage in literature, finding it ironically fitting for her situation. As Mrs. Henderson discussed the themes in To Kill a Mockingbird, Sarah wondered if she would ever find her own Atticus Finch, someone willing to stand up for what was right. During lunch break, Sarah sat alone at her usual table in the corner of the cafeteria. She had learned to bring her own lunch since navigating the lunch line with her wheelchair often resulted in accidents, where other students would bump into her, causing her to drop her tray. Today she unwrapped her sandwich and tried to read her book while eating, hoping to blend into the background. Her peace was short-lived. Jessica and her group approached her table, their faces wearing the cruel smirks that Sarah had come to dread. "Hey Sarah," Jessica said in a fake sweet voice. "We were just wondering if you wanted to join the track team." "Oh wait, that's right, you can't run." The group burst into laughter at Jessica's cruel joke. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she had learned that responding only made things worse. She kept her eyes on her book, pretending to read the same sentence over and over. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" Another girl, Madison, chimed in. "Or maybe you're too busy feeling sorry for yourself to talk to us normal people." Sarah's hands trembled as she held her book. She wanted to say something, anything to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Years of this treatment had worn down her confidence to almost nothing. She felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "You know what I heard?" Jessica continued, pulling out a chair to sit across from Sarah. "I heard that you used to be a dancer before your accident. Is that true? Did you really think you were going to be some kind of star?" Sarah's heart clenched. Dancing had been her life before the accident. She had been accepted to a prestigious dance academy and had dreams of performing on Broadway. The accident had stolen more than just her ability to walk. It had taken her dreams, her identity, and her future as she had imagined it. "I bet you were terrible anyway," Madison added with a laugh. "Probably did everyone a favor by getting you off the stage." This comment finally broke through Sarah's resolve. A tear slipped down her cheek and she quickly wiped it away, but not before Jessica noticed. "Aw, poor little cripple is going to cry," Jessica mocked. "Maybe you should call your mommy to come pick you up." "Oh wait, she's probably embarrassed to be seen with you too." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Her mother, Linda, was actually her biggest supporter and had never made her feel like a burden. But Jessica's words planted seeds of doubt that Sarah had been fighting since her accident. Did people really see her as an embarrassment? Was she just a burden on everyone around her? Sarah gathered her things quickly, shoving them into her backpack. She needed to get away before she completely broke down in front of them. As she turned her wheelchair to leave, Jessica stuck out her foot, catching the wheel and causing Sarah to jolt forward awkwardly. "Oops," Jessica said with false innocence. "Guess I didn't see you there. You're pretty easy to miss sitting down there." The entire cafeteria had gone quiet, watching the scene unfold. Sarah looked around desperately, hoping anyone, would say something to help her. But the other students either looked away uncomfortably or watched with morbid curiosity. Not a single person stood up for her. Sarah managed to navigate around Jessica's deliberately placed foot and wheeled quickly toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear Jessica's group laughing and making more cruel comments about her hasty retreat. The sound echoed in the large cafeteria, seeming to bounce off the walls and follow her as she escaped. She found refuge in the school library, where Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, greeted her with a kind smile. Mrs. Patterson was one of the few adults at school who treated Sarah with genuine warmth and respect. The elderly woman had never once mentioned Sarah's disability or treated her differently because of it. "How are you doing today, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked softly, perhaps noticing Sarah's red-rimmed eyes. "I'm okay," Sarah lied, not wanting to burden the kind woman with her problems. As Sarah sat among the quiet shelves of books, she thought about her life before the accident. She had been popular, confident, and full of dreams. Now she felt like a shadow of her former self, invisible except when others wanted to make her the target of their cruelty. She opened her notebook and began writing in her journal, something her therapist had suggested to help process her emotions. The words flowed onto the page, describing her pain, her loneliness, and her desperate wish for someone to see her as more than just a girl in a wheelchair. She wrote about missing her old life, about feeling trapped not just by her physical limitations but by the way others perceived her. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Sarah closed her journal and prepared to face the rest of the day. She had no idea that across town, a group of leather-clad motorcyclists was about to enter her life in a way that would change everything. The afternoon classes passed in a blur for Sarah, each period bringing new opportunities for her classmates to make her feel small and unwelcome. In chemistry lab, her assigned partner conveniently found excuses to work alone, leaving Sarah to struggle with the equipment by herself. During history class, when she was called upon to answer a question, someone in the back whispered, "Speak up." "Wheels," causing a ripple of snickers throughout the room. By the time the final bell rang, Sarah felt emotionally drained. She gathered her belongings slowly, waiting for the hallways to clear before making her way to the parking lot where her mother would be waiting to pick her up. The adapted van with its wheelchair lift was both a blessing and a source of embarrassment for Sarah, marking her as different even in the parking lot. As she approached the exit, Sarah heard her name being called. She turned to see Tyler Morrison jogging to catch up with her. Tyler was in her English class and had never been particularly cruel to her, but he had never been kind either. He was part of the athletic crowd, popular but not mean-spirited like Jessica's group. "Hey Sarah, wait up," he called, slightly out of breath when he reached her. Sarah stopped, curious but wary. In her experience, when popular kids sought her out, it rarely ended well for her. "I just wanted to say," Tyler began, then paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "What happened at lunch today? That was really messed up." Jessica and her friends were way out of line. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe someone had noticed after all. Maybe Tyler was going to offer to help or stand up for her in the future. "I felt really bad watching it," he continued, and Sarah's heart lifted slightly. "But you know how it is. If I got involved, they'd probably just make things worse for both of us. Jessica can be really vindictive when people cross her." The hope that had briefly sparked in Sarah's chest died as quickly as it had appeared. Tyler wasn't offering to help. He was explaining why he wouldn't help. His words stung almost as much as Jessica's cruelty because they came wrapped in false sympathy. "I understand," Sarah said quietly, though she didn't really understand at all. How could someone watch another person being tormented and choose to do nothing? How could self-preservation matter more than basic human decency? "I'm sure it'll get better," Tyler added lamely, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "Maybe you could try sitting somewhere else at lunch. Like find a table where those girls don't usually go." Sarah stared at him, amazed by his suggestion that she should be the one to change her behavior. She should hide away even more than she already did, make herself even smaller just to avoid being targeted. The suggestion made her realize how truly alone she was in this situation. "Sure," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll think about that." Tyler seemed relieved that the conversation was over and hurried away to catch up with his friends who were waiting by the school's main entrance. Sarah watched him go, feeling more isolated than ever. Even potential allies were too concerned with their own social standing to offer real support. The ride home with her mother was quiet. Linda Mitchell glanced at her daughter through the rearview mirror, noticing the slumped shoulders and distant expression that had become all too familiar over the past months. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Linda asked gently. "Fine," Sarah replied automatically. staring out the window at the passing houses where normal families lived normal lives. Linda knew better than to push when Sarah was in this mood, but her heart ached for her daughter. Before the accident, Sarah had been vibrant and talkative, always eager to share the details of her day. Now conversations had to be carefully coaxed out of her, and Linda often felt like she was walking on eggshells around her own child. At home, Sarah retreated to her room while Linda prepared dinner. The Mitchell house had been extensively modified after Sarah's accident, with ramps, widened doorways, and a specially designed bathroom. While these modifications made Sarah's life more manageable, they also served as constant reminders of how much everything had changed. Sarah's room was on the first floor now, converted from what had been Linda's home office. Her old room upstairs, with its dance trophies and posters of famous dancers, had been left exactly as it was the day of the accident. Neither Sarah nor her mother had been able to face the task of packing it up or converting it to something else. As Sarah sat at her desk, supposedly working on homework but actually staring blankly at her textbook, she heard the distant rumble of motorcycles passing by on the main road. The sound was becoming more frequent lately, as the weather warmed up and motorcycle enthusiasts took to the roads for spring rides. The sound reminded her of her father, who had died in military service when she was 12. He had owned a motorcycle and had promised to teach her to ride it when she turned 16. That promise, like so many other dreams, had been buried along with her ability to walk. Meanwhile, across town at Murphy's Bar and Grill, a different kind of gathering was taking place. The Guardians, a motorcycle club known throughout the county, had stopped for their weekly meetup. Unlike the stereotypical image of outlaw bikers, the Guardians were a group of veterans, working professionals, and community members who shared a love of motorcycles and a commitment to helping those who couldn't help themselves. Jake Hammer Rodriguez, the club's president, sat at the head of a long table, his weathered face serious as he listened to reports from various club members about community issues they'd encountered during the week. The Guardians had made it their mission to be the protectors of the vulnerable, particularly children and those who couldn't defend themselves. "What else we got?" Jake asked, his gravelly voice commanding attention from the dozen or so members present. Maria Santos, one of the club's few female members and a high school guidance counselor, raised her hand. "I've been hearing troubling things about bullying at Riverside High. There's a girl there, disabled kid, who's been getting tormented pretty regularly. The administration doesn't seem to be doing much about it." Jake's expression darkened. As a former military police officer, he had zero tolerance for those who preyed on the vulnerable. "What kind of situation are we talking about?" "From what I've heard, it's pretty bad," Maria continued. "Daily harassment, public humiliation, the whole 9 yards. The kid's name's Sarah Mitchell. Apparently she was a dancer before she ended up in a wheelchair. Now she's basically being tortured by some of the popular kids, especially this Jessica Crawford girl." "Crawford," muttered Tommy Diesel Murphy, the bar's owner and a longtime club member. "That name sounds familiar. Rich family, right? Dad's some kind of real estate developer?" "That's the one," Maria confirmed. "Kid thinks she owns the school because her family has money. Meanwhile, this Sarah girl is just trying to get through each day." Jake drummed his fingers on the table, a habit that usually meant he was formulating a plan. The Guardians had dealt with bullying situations before, but each case required careful consideration. They couldn't just roar up to a high school on their bikes and intimidate teenagers, no matter how satisfying that might be. "We need more information," Jake decided. "Maria, can you find out more about the specifics? When does this usually happen? Where? Who else is involved?" "I can do some digging," Maria nodded. "But Jake, we need to be careful how we handle this. These aren't street thugs we're dealing with. This Jessica girl and her friends come from influential families. If we mess this up, it could cause problems for the club." Jake's jaw tightened. "I don't care if her daddy owns half the county. Nobody gets to torture a disabled kid on my watch. Nobody." The other club members murmured their agreement. This was why they had formed the Guardians in the first place, to stand up for people who had nowhere else to turn. They had intervened in domestic violence situations, helped kids escape gang recruitment, and even tracked down deadbeat parents who weren't paying child support. A group of privileged teenagers bullying a disabled girl was exactly the kind of injustice that motivated them. "Let's do this right," Jake continued. "We gather intelligence, we plan carefully, and then we make sure this Sarah kid never has to worry about being bullied again." And we make sure Jessica Crawford and her little gang learn what happens when you pick on someone who can't fight back. As the meeting broke up, the members of the Guardians began to disperse, but the seed of a plan had been planted. None of them knew Sarah Mitchell personally, but that didn't matter. She was a member of their community, and that made her their responsibility to protect. The next morning brought no relief for Sarah. If anything, Jessica Crawford seemed emboldened by yesterday's successful humiliation, and the harassment began even before first period. Sarah was at her locker, struggling to balance her textbooks while maneuvering her wheelchair, when she felt someone deliberately bump into her from behind. "Oops, sorry." Jessica's voice dripped with false sweetness. "Didn't see you down there. You really should wear some kind of flag or something so people know you're there." Sarah's textbooks scattered across the floor, and as she bent forward to try to collect them, Jessica's friend Madison stepped on one of them, leaving a dirty footprint on the cover. "Oh no, your book got all dirty," Madison said with mock concern. "Here, let me help you clean it off." She picked up the book and made a show of brushing it off, but instead made the dirt smudge worse. Other students walking by either ignored the scene entirely or watched with uncomfortable expressions, but did nothing to intervene. Sarah gathered her books quickly, her face burning with embarrassment. She stuffed them into her backpack haphazardly and wheeled away as fast as she could, hearing Jessica's laughter echoing behind her. In first period English, Mrs. Henderson assigned a group project on character analysis. Sarah's heart sank as she watched her classmates quickly form groups of friends, leaving her sitting alone. When Mrs. Henderson noticed Sarah hadn't joined a group, she tried to assign her to one, but the groups she approached all claimed they were already full or had too much work divided among existing members. "Sarah, you can work with Jessica's group," Mrs. Henderson finally decided. "They only have 3 members, so adding a 4th will balance things out." Jessica's face darkened at this announcement, but she couldn't openly object without revealing her true feelings about Sarah to the teacher. "Of course," she said with a plastic smile. "We'd love to have Sarah join us." As the class period progressed and students began planning their projects, Jessica's group completely ignored Sarah. When Sarah tried to contribute ideas, they acted as if she hadn't spoken. When she asked about their chosen book, they told her they'd already decided everything and she could just put her name on the final project. "But I want to actually help with the work," Sarah protested quietly. "Trust me, you'll just slow us down," Jessica replied coldly. "This is an important grade and we can't afford to let you mess it up for us." During lunch, Sarah decided to take Tyler's advice and find a different place to sit. She discovered a small table near the emergency exit where she thought she might be able to eat in peace. For a few minutes, it seemed like her plan might work. She unwrapped her sandwich and opened her book, grateful for the temporary respite. Her peace was shattered when Jessica and her entire group approached, carrying their lunch trays. "Well, look who's trying to hide from us," Jessica announced loudly. "Did you think you could escape that easily?" Sarah's stomach dropped. She had hoped that by moving to a different location, Jessica might simply lose interest in tormenting her. Instead, her attempt to avoid confrontation had only made her seem like a coward. "We were actually looking for you," Madison chimed in. "We have something special planned for you today." Before Sarah could react, Madison accidentally tripped, dumping her entire lunch tray across Sarah's lap. Chocolate milk soaked through her jeans and pieces of salad landed in her hair. The crash of the falling tray drew the attention of the entire cafeteria. "Oh my goodness, I'm so clumsy," Madison exclaimed loudly, her voice carrying across the now silent cafeteria. "I guess I'm as unsteady on my feet as you are." The comment drew cruel laughter from several tables. Sarah sat there, dripping with milk and covered in food, feeling more humiliated than she had ever felt in her life. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to clean herself off with napkins, but the damage was too extensive. "Guess you'll need to call Mommy to bring you clean clothes," Jessica added, "unless you want to sit around smelling like spoiled milk all day." Sarah knew she had to get out of the cafeteria before she completely broke down. She gathered what she could of her belongings, leaving her ruined lunch behind, and wheeled toward the exit as quickly as possible. Behind her, she could hear the buzz of conversation resuming, punctuated by occasional laughter and cruel comments about the incident. In the bathroom, Sarah tried to clean herself up as best she could, but her clothes were soaked and stained. She called her mother from her cell phone, her voice shaking as she explained that she needed to be picked up from school. Linda Mitchell arrived within 20 minutes, taking one look at her daughter's disheveled state and immediately understanding that this was not an accident. She helped Sarah gather her things and get into the van without asking too many questions, knowing that Sarah would tell her what happened when she was ready. What neither of them knew was that Maria Santos had witnessed the entire cafeteria incident. As the guidance counselor, she had been monitoring the lunch period when she saw the confrontation unfold. She had been about to intervene when Madison dumped the tray on Sarah, but the damage was already done by the time she could reach them. Maria was furious. She had seen bullying before, but the calculated cruelty of what had just happened exceeded anything in her experience. These girls weren't just being thoughtlessly mean. They were systematically trying to destroy another student's sense of self-worth. That evening, Maria called Jake Rodriguez. "It's worse than I thought," she told him without preamble. "I saw them humiliate this girl in front of the entire school today. They dumped food all over her, Jake. They're not just bullying her, they're trying to break her spirit completely." Jake listened in silence as Maria described the cafeteria incident in detail. His hands clenched into fists as she spoke, and by the time she finished, his voice was deadly quiet. "Get me everything you can on these kids," he said. "Names, addresses, schedules, family information, everything." "Jake, we have to be smart about this," Maria warned. "These families have connections. If we handle this wrong, if we don't handle this at all, that girl is going to end up doing something desperate," Jake interrupted. "I've seen what this kind of systematic abuse does to people. It destroys them from the inside out." Maria knew he was right. In her years as a guidance counselor, she had seen too many students reach their breaking point. The signs were all there with Sarah: the isolation, the obvious depression, the way she had simply accepted the abuse as if she deserved it. "What are you thinking?" Maria asked. "I'm thinking it's time Jessica Crawford and her friends learned that actions have consequences," Jake replied grimly. "And I'm thinking they're about to discover that not everyone in this world is going to let them get away with torturing people who can't fight back." After hanging up with Maria, Jake called an emergency meeting of the Guardians. Within an hour, a dozen leather-clad bikers had assembled at Murphy's bar, their faces grim as Jake explained the situation. "This isn't just about one kid anymore," Jake told them. "This is about sending a message that our community doesn't tolerate predators, whether they're gang members on the street or spoiled rich kids in high school." Tommy Murphy, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "My daughter goes to that school," he said quietly. "She's never mentioned this Sarah girl, but she's talked about Jessica Crawford. Says she's a real piece of work who thinks she owns the place because her daddy has money." "What are you proposing we do?" asked Marcus Steele Washington, a veteran who worked as a construction foreman. Jake's smile was cold and didn't reach his eyes. "I'm proposing we pay a visit to Riverside High School. It's time these kids learned that there are adults in this community who won't stand by and watch them destroy someone's life." The Guardians began making plans, each member contributing their expertise to ensure their intervention would be both effective and legal. They weren't just a group of angry bikers looking for trouble. They were organized, experienced men and women who knew how to handle delicate situations involving minors. As they planned, none of them knew that across town, Sarah Mitchell was lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if life would ever be worth living again. The systematic cruelty she faced every day was wearing down her will to keep fighting, and she was beginning to think that maybe everyone would be better off if she just disappeared. Sarah returned to school the next day wearing clean clothes but carrying the invisible scars of yesterday's humiliation. Word of the cafeteria incident had spread throughout the school, and she could feel eyes following her as she navigated the hallways. Some students looked at her with pity, others with morbid curiosity, but most just looked away uncomfortably when she approached. The group project in English class had become another source of torment. Jessica's group had deliberately scheduled all their meetings at times when Sarah couldn't attend, claiming they needed to work around everyone else's schedules. When Sarah asked Mrs. Henderson if she could switch to a different group, Jessica quickly intervened. "Oh no, Mrs. Henderson, Sarah doesn't need to switch," Jessica said with false concern. "We've been trying to include her, but she keeps missing our study sessions. Maybe she's just not as committed to the project as the rest of us." Mrs. Henderson looked confused, glancing between Sarah and Jessica. Sarah wanted to explain that she had never been told about any study sessions, but she knew that speaking up would only make Jessica retaliate more viciously later. I'm sure you can all work together to find meeting times that work for everyone," Mrs. Henderson said diplomatically, not realizing she was essentially sentencing Sarah to more exclusion and sabotage. During chemistry class, Sarah's regular lab partner was absent, leaving her to work alone on a complex experiment. As she struggled to manage the equipment from her wheelchair, she accidentally knocked over a beaker. The crash drew everyone's attention and she could hear snickers from across the room. "Careful there, Butterfingers," called out Brad Martinez, one of Jessica's friends. "Maybe they should give you plastic equipment so you can't break anything important." Mr. Kowalski, the chemistry teacher, helped Sarah clean up the spill, but also suggested that she might want to ask for assistance with future labs. His suggestion was well-meaning, but it made Sarah feel even more incompetent and different from her classmates. By lunchtime, Sarah was dreading entering the cafeteria. She had brought her lunch again and planned to find another quiet corner where she might be left alone. As she entered the large room, she noticed something unusual. There was an unusual amount of activity near the main entrance, with students craning their necks to look at something outside. Sarah wheeled to her chosen table and tried to ignore the commotion. But the noise level in the cafeteria kept growing. Students were talking excitedly and pointing toward the windows that faced the parking lot. "Holy crap, look at all those motorcycles," she heard someone say. Sarah looked up from her sandwich to see what everyone was talking about. Through the cafeteria windows, she could see a line of gleaming motorcycles pulling into the school parking lot. The bikes were impressive. Big touring bikes and powerful cruisers that rumbled with authority even at idle. The riders dismounted in unison, and Sarah could see they were all wearing leather jackets with some kind of patch or emblem on the back. Even from a distance they looked intimidating, not in a threatening way but in the way that commanded respect and attention. "Who are they?" Madison asked nervously, appearing at the window near Sarah's table. "I think they're some kind of motorcycle club," another student replied. "My dad always warns me about gangs like that." But Sarah noticed something different about these riders. They moved with discipline and purpose, not the chaotic energy she associated with the motorcycle gangs she'd seen in movies. They seemed organized, almost military in their precision. The bikers walked toward the school's main entrance and the cafeteria fell silent as everyone watched through the windows. Sarah found herself drawn into the spectacle, temporarily forgetting her own problems as she tried to figure out what was happening. Jessica Crawford appeared at Sarah's table, her face pale and worried. For once, she wasn't focused on tormenting Sarah. She was genuinely frightened by the arrival of the mysterious bikers. "What do you think they want?" Jessica asked, speaking to her friends but loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Maybe someone called them," Madison suggested nervously. "Like maybe someone's in trouble." Sarah felt a strange flutter in her stomach. Could this have something to do with her? No, that was impossible. She didn't know anyone who rode motorcycles, and she certainly hadn't contacted any biker gang for help. The idea was absurd. Minutes passed, and the normal chatter of the cafeteria remained subdued as students continued to speculate about the visitors. Then the cafeteria doors opened, and Principal Williams entered, followed by several of the leather-clad bikers. Sarah's heart began to race as she got her first close look at them. The man leading the group was tall and imposing, with graying hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Despite their intimidating appearance, the bikers moved calmly and respectfully through the cafeteria. Principal Williams looked nervous as he approached the center of the room with the bikers flanking him. He cleared his throat and called for attention. "Students, these are members of a local community organization called the Guardians," he announced, his voice slightly shaky. "They've come to speak with you about some concerns they have regarding the treatment of fellow students." The lead biker stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every person in the room. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority. "My name is Jake Rodriguez," he said, his eyes scanning the room slowly. "My friends and I heard about some troubling behavior happening at this school. Behavior that we find unacceptable in our community." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Could this really be about her situation? It seemed too incredible to believe, but Jake's eyes seemed to linger on her table as he spoke. "We believe strongly that everyone deserves to feel safe and respected, especially in places of learning," Jake continued. "We've heard reports of students being targeted, humiliated, and tormented simply because they're different or because some people think they're easy targets." Jessica shifted uncomfortably beside Sarah's table, her face growing paler by the second. Around the cafeteria, other students began to look nervous as they realized this wasn't just a random visit. "Now, we're not here to threaten anyone," Jake said, his tone remaining calm but his message clear. "We're here as concerned members of the community to let you know that we're watching. We're paying attention to what happens in this school, and we won't tolerate anyone being victimized." One of the other bikers, a woman with short gray hair and kind but stern eyes, stepped forward. Sarah recognized her as Mrs. Santos from the guidance office, though she had never connected her with a motorcycle club. "Some of you might think that because you come from wealthy families or because you're popular, you can treat others however you want without consequences," Maria Santos said. "Let me assure you that's not the case. We don't care who your parents are or how much money your family has. Right is right and wrong is wrong." Jake nodded and addressed the room again. "We want to be very clear about something. If we hear about anyone, and I mean anyone, continuing to harass, bully, or victimize their fellow students, especially those who can't defend themselves, there will be consequences." Sarah watched in amazement as Jessica practically shrank into herself. The girl who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just minutes ago now looked like a scared child trying to make herself invisible. "We know who you are," Jake continued, his eyes moving deliberately around the room. "We know where you live, we know your families, and we know your routines. We're not threatening you. We're promising you that if the abuse continues, we will make sure there are appropriate consequences." The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. Sarah had never seen her classmates so quiet or so genuinely frightened. For the first time since her accident, she felt like someone was fighting for her, standing up for her in a way that no adult at the school ever had. "We believe in second chances," Jake said, his voice softening slightly. "Everyone makes mistakes, especially young people. But this is your warning, and it's the only one you're going to get. Choose kindness over cruelty. Choose respect over humiliation. Choose to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." With that, the guardians turned and walked out of the cafeteria as calmly as they had entered, leaving behind a room full of stunned students and one disabled girl who suddenly felt like she had found her protectors. The transformation at Riverside High School was immediate and dramatic. In the hours following the guardian's visit, word spread throughout the building about what had happened in the cafeteria. Students who had witnessed the encounter described it in hushed, awed tones to those who hadn't been there. Sarah noticed the change before she even finished her lunch. Students who had previously looked through her or away from her were now making eye contact, some even offering tentative smiles. The atmosphere in the cafeteria had shifted completely. Where there had been an undercurrent of casual cruelty, there was now a palpable sense of caution and reflection. Jessica Crawford had disappeared entirely after the guardians left. Madison and the rest of her group sat huddled together at their usual table, speaking in whispers and glancing nervously toward the exits. The confident, predatory energy that had defined their group was completely gone, replaced by genuine fear and uncertainty. As Sarah made her way to her afternoon classes, she experienced something she hadn't felt in months: hope. For the first time since her accident, she felt like someone had seen her pain and chosen to act. The guardians hadn't mentioned her by name, but their message had been unmistakably clear, and their presence had created a shield of protection around her that she could almost feel. In chemistry class, Brad Martinez, who had mocked her earlier for dropping the beaker, actually offered to be her lab partner when he saw her working alone. His manner was awkward and clearly motivated by fear rather than genuine kindness, but Sarah didn't care about his motivations. The important thing was that the torment had stopped. "Hey, Sarah," Brad said nervously as he approached her lab station. "Want to work together on this experiment? I mean, if you want to. You don't have to or anything." Sarah looked at him, carefully waiting for the cruel punchline or hidden agenda, but Brad seemed genuinely nervous and sincere. "Sure," she said quietly. "That would be nice." As they worked together on the lab assignment, Brad was respectful and helpful, sharing the equipment and actually listening when Sarah contributed ideas. It was a small thing, but for Sarah, it felt like a miracle. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated as an equal by her peers. Word of the guardian's intervention spread beyond the school walls as well. By evening, Parents throughout the community were discussing the unusual visit. Some were concerned about outside groups getting involved in school affairs, while others were quietly grateful that someone was finally addressing problems the school administration had failed to handle. Linda Mitchell received several phone calls that evening from other parents. Some were curious about whether the visit had anything to do with Sarah, while others wanted to express support for what the guardians had done. Linda was careful not to reveal too much about Sarah's experiences, but she felt a deep sense of relief knowing that her daughter's suffering hadn't gone unnoticed by the community. The next morning, Sarah arrived at school with a feeling she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation instead of dread. She was curious to see how things would continue to unfold, whether the changes from yesterday would hold, or if Jessica and her group would find new ways to make her life miserable. Her first indication that things had truly changed came during first period English. Mrs. Henderson announced that she was allowing students to reform their project groups if they felt their current arrangement wasn't working well. Before Sarah could even consider her options, Tyler Morrison turned around in his seat. "Sarah want to be in our group?" he asked, gesturing to include two other students she recognized as decent, hard-working classmates. "We could really use someone with your insights on character analysis." Sarah stared at him, remembering his previous reluctance to get involved when she was being bullied, but she also remembered that he had been the only one to express any sympathy for her situation, even if he hadn't been brave enough to act on it. People could change, and perhaps Tyler was finding his courage now that the social landscape had shifted. "I'd like that," Sarah said, surprised to hear her own voice sounding stronger and more confident than it had in months. As they began planning their project, Sarah discovered that her new group members actually valued her contributions. They listened to her ideas, asked for her opinions, and treated her as an equal member of the team. It was a stark contrast to Jessica's group, where she had been treated like an unwelcome burden. During lunch, Sarah decided to sit at her usual table in the corner, but this time she wasn't alone. Amy Chen, a quiet girl from her history class, approached with her lunch tray. "Mind if I sit here?" Amy asked. "It's been pretty crazy everywhere else today." Sarah nodded, welcoming the company. Amy sat down and began eating, and after a few minutes of comfortable silence, she spoke again. "What those bikers did yesterday was pretty amazing," Amy said quietly. "I've been thinking about it all day. It must take real courage to stand up for people like that." Sarah considered Amy's words. She had been so focused on her own relief that she hadn't thought much about the courage it had required for the guardians to intervene. They could have chosen to ignore the situation, to decide it wasn't their problem. Instead, they had taken a risk to protect someone they didn't even know. "It was amazing," Sarah agreed. "I never thought anyone would actually do something like that." Amy nodded thoughtfully. "It makes you think about what we could do differently, you know? Like maybe we all could have been braver before this happened." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tyler and two of his friends, who asked if they could join them at the table. Soon, Sarah found herself part of an actual group conversation for the first time in years. They talked about their classes, their project, and their thoughts about the previous day's events. The most remarkable thing about the conversation was how normal it felt. No one mentioned Sarah's wheelchair unless it was relevant to the practical aspects of something they were discussing. No one treated her as fragile or different or pitiable. She was just another student, part of the group, contributing and belonging in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Across the cafeteria, Jessica Crawford sat with her remaining friends, picking at her food and stealing nervous glances around the room. The confident queen bee persona that had defined her for years had crumbled under the weight of real consequences. She kept thinking about Jake Rodriguez's words about knowing where she lived and knowing her family. For the first time in her life, Jessica was experiencing what it felt like to be afraid at school, to wonder if each day would bring new humiliation or consequences for her actions. The fear was teaching her something she had never learned from years of privilege and enabling: empathy for the people she had tormented. Madison leaned across the table toward Jessica. "Do you think they're really watching us?" she whispered nervously. Jessica nodded grimly. "My dad made some calls last night. The guardians are legitimate. They're veterans and professionals who do community service work. They're not criminals, which means we can't just have them arrested or scared off. And that makes them more dangerous, not less. For the first time, Jessica was beginning to understand the true weight of her actions. She had spent years believing that her family's money and status made her untouchable, that she could treat people however she wanted without facing real consequences. The Guardians had shattered that illusion in a single visit. As Sarah finished her lunch surrounded by new friends who actually wanted her company, she reflected on how dramatically her world had changed in just 2 days. The constant fear and dread that had defined her school experience had been replaced by something she had almost forgotten existed: hope for the future. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since her accident, she was looking forward to finding out. The transport ship Meridian's Edge shuddered as it touched down on the ice-covered surface of Kepler 442c. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the porthole, watching the swirling snow dance across the alien landscape. This was supposed to be a routine medical supply run to the mining colony. But something felt different about this place. The silence was too complete, too absolute. "Another dead rock," muttered Captain Torres from the pilot's seat. "Why humans insist on digging holes in every frozen wasteland in the galaxy is beyond me." Sarah didn't respond. She was too busy studying the abandoned structures scattered across the plateau. The mining equipment sat motionless, covered in a thick layer of frost that suggested it hadn't been used in weeks. Emergency beacons blinked weakly through the storm, their red lights cutting through the perpetual twilight of this distant world. When the cargo bay doors finally opened, Sarah was the first to step out. Her breath immediately formed clouds in the bitter air, despite her environmental suit's heating systems working overtime. The temperature readings on her wrist display showed -47 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to kill most known life forms within minutes. The mining colony's medical bay was her first stop. As the only qualified xenobiologist and trauma surgeon in this sector, Sarah had seen her share of disasters. Tunnel collapses, equipment failures, atmospheric breaches. But when she pushed open the medical bay doors, she found something that made her stomach turn. 3 bodies lay on examination tables, covered by thermal blankets. The miners had died from exposure, but not in the way she expected. Their faces showed signs of peaceful sleep, rather than the agony typically associated with freezing to death. More disturbing were the deep claw marks on their environmental suits and the strange purple substance coating their gloves. They were trying to save something, Sarah whispered to herself, examining the tears in the fabric. The claw marks were too small for any known predator, too precise to be random. A soft whimpering sound made her freeze. It was barely audible over the wind howling through the colony's broken structures, but Sarah's trained ear caught it immediately. Medical instinct kicked in as she followed the sound through the facility's darkened corridors. The noise led her to a storage room at the back of the complex. When she activated her headlamp, the beam illuminated a sight that broke her heart. Huddled in the corner beneath a pile of emergency blankets were 3 small creatures that looked like wolf cubs. But their fur shimmered with an otherworldly blue-silver color, and their eyes glowed with a soft amber light. They were alien, undoubtedly, but they were also clearly babies, and they were dying. The largest of the 3, no bigger than Sarah's fist, tried to lift its head when her light found them. Its breathing was shallow and labored, tiny chest rising and falling with obvious effort. The other 2 weren't moving at all, though Sarah could detect faint life signs with her medical scanner. "Oh, you poor little things," she breathed, kneeling down slowly. The surviving pup's ears twitched at her voice, and it made a sound somewhere between a whine and a purr. Sarah's hand shook as she ran preliminary scans. The creature's body temperature was dropping rapidly, their metabolism shutting down to conserve what little energy remained. Without intervention, they would be dead within the hour. But here was the problem that made Sarah's colleagues consider her reckless. She couldn't walk away from suffering, no matter what species was involved. While other humans might see 3 dying alien animals, Sarah saw 3 babies who needed help. She gathered the creatures carefully, wrapping them in her own heated emergency blanket. They weighed almost nothing, their bodies cold as ice despite the thick fur. The largest one opened its eyes as she lifted it, revealing intelligence that definitely wasn't animal. "I don't know what you are," Sarah murmured, cradling them against her chest. "But nobody dies on my watch if I can help it." The journey back to her ship felt endless. Captain Torres was already running pre-flight checks when she burst into the medical bay with her unexpected patients. "Chen, what the hell are you doing?" he called from the cockpit. "We need to file our report and get out of here before this storm gets worse." "Medical emergency," Sarah called back, not technically lying. She activated the medical bay's warming systems and began setting up an improvised intensive care unit. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared IV lines, oxygen supplies, and monitoring equipment. She had no idea if human medical technology would be compatible with alien physiology, but she had to try. The alternative was letting them die, and that simply wasn't an option. The smallest pup's vital signs were failing fast. Sarah made a decision that would have horrified the Galactic Medical Board. She began administering human medications in tiny doses, adjusting for the creature's size and hoping their biology was similar enough to benefit rather than be poisoned. As the ship lifted off from Kepler 442c, Sarah worked frantically to stabilize her patients. She injected glucose solutions to fight hypothermia, administered oxygen to support their failing respiratory systems, and wrapped them in thermal blankets connected to the ship's heating grid. Sarah, Captain Torres, appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern when he saw her patients. "What are those things?" "I don't know," she admitted, not looking up from her work. "But they're babies and they were left to die. The miners must have found them and tried to help before." She gestured helplessly toward the planet now shrinking behind them. For the next 6 hours, Sarah fought to keep the alien pups alive. She monitored their vital signs constantly, adjusted their treatment protocols, and talked to them in soothing voices whenever they seemed distressed. The largest one, which she had started calling Hope in her mind, occasionally opened its eyes to look at her with what seemed like gratitude. By the time they reached the nearest space station, Sarah had managed to stabilize all 3 patients. Their body temperatures were rising, their breathing had improved, and they were actually responding to her voice. But this was just the beginning of a much larger challenge. Nobody in the galaxy cared about 3 frozen alien wolf pups. Nobody except one stubborn human medic who refused to give up on patients, no matter what species they belonged to.